How does a backpack end up 80 feet high in a tree? In 2024, arborists in Sequoia found one lodged in the canopy. Inside was a 10-year-old girl's journal with entries dated 3 days after she vanished. But here's what made investigators stop cold. The tree was far too massive to climb without ropes, yet the father's phone, recovered from that same backpack, had photos taken from 80 feet up, showing the forest below. The Harper family disappeared in Sequoia National Park on June 3, 2014. Robert Harper, 38, his wife Michelle, 36, their daughter Sophia, 10. They were on day 3 of a 7-day backpacking trip through the giant forest area. When they failed to check in at their scheduled waypoint, rangers began searching on June 7th. The initial search found their last campsite quickly. It was near the base of a massive sequoia known locally as the Sentinel Tree. The site showed signs of a hasty departure. One tent was half collapsed. Cooking gear was scattered. Michelle's jacket was draped over a log, but the family was gone. What made the scene unusual was the silence from their emergency beacon. The Harpers had rented a satellite communicator specifically for this trip. Robert had texted updates to his brother every evening. The last message came on June 2nd. Amazing day. Sophia climbed her first big tree with help. Weather perfect. All good here. Then, nothing. The search expanded rapidly. Sequoia's terrain is challenging in its own way. The giant trees create a canopy so dense that GPS signals become unreliable. The forest floor is littered with decades of fallen timber. Visibility drops to just a few yards in some areas. You can be 10 feet from someone and never see them. Search dogs track the family's scent east from the campsite toward a drainage area that led to higher elevations, but after half a mile, the trail simply ended, not faded, not confused, just stopped, as if the family had been lifted off the ground. The lead investigator, a ranger named Thomas Blake, found that detail disturbing. He'd worked search and rescue in Sequoia for 16 years. He knew how scent trails behave. They dispersed, they weakened, they got confused by water or weather, but they didn't just stop unless something interrupted them. What could interrupt a scent trail that abruptly? He asked the dog handler. The handler, a woman named Rita Chen, shook her head. In theory, fast-moving water, but there's no water here. Or if they got into a vehicle, but there's no road within 5 miles. Or ... She hesitated. Or what? Or if they went up instead of forward. Thomas looked at the massive sequoias surrounding them. Some were over 200 feet tall. Their lowest branches started 60 feet off the ground. You're saying they climbed? I'm saying the scent goes up, not out. My dogs keep looking up. They're trained to track ground scent. When they lose it this completely, it usually means vertical displacement. But why would an entire family climb a giant sequoia? And more importantly, how? These weren't normal trees. Their bark was thick and rough, yes, but the trunks were so wide that wrapping your arms around them was impossible. The first branches were unreachable without serious climbing equipment. The Harpers had basic gear, rope for hanging food bag, carabiners for securing pack, but nothing that would facilitate a climb of that magnitude. Days turned into weeks. The search area expanded to cover over 60 square miles. Helicopters with thermal imaging flew grid patterns. Volunteers checked every trail, every campsite, every fishing spot. They found nothing. By June 21st, the official search was suspended. The Harpers were classified as missing person. The case was filed away with dozens of other unsolved disappearances in America's national park. Robert's brother, James Harper, refused to accept it. He spent his savings hiring private search teams. He lobbied park officials for continued searches. He created a website documenting every detail of the case. But 10 years passed with no answers. Then, in April of 2024, A tree service company was hired to assess the health of several giant sequoias near the Sentinel tree. The Park Service had concerns about root damage from years of drought. Arborists needed to inspect the upper canopy, areas that hadn't been visually examined in decades. Kyle Morrison was 70 feet up the Sentinel tree when he saw it, a dark shape wedged in the fork of a massive branch. At first, he thought it was a bird's nest or accumulated debris, but as he got closer, his stomach dropped. It was a backpack, faded blue fabric, partially torn, straps tangled in smaller branches, and it was far too intact to have been up there for long, except, as Kyle would later tell investigators, it had clearly been there for years. The fabric showed UV damage. Moss was growing on one side. This wasn't recent. Kyle radioed his supervisor. Within hours, the Park Service was on site. A technical rescue team was assembled to safely retrieve the backpack. By late afternoon, it was on the ground. The name tag inside read, Sophia Harper. Thomas Blake was retired by then, living in Oregon, but when he got the call, he was on a plane the next morning. He needed to see this himself. The backpack was taken to a forensic lab in Fresno. Every item was cataloged: a water bottle, empty; a granola bar wrapper; a small stuffed elephant, well worn; a journal with a purple cover; and a phone in a waterproof case. The journal was what made Thomas's hands shake as he read it. The first entries were typical 10-year-old observations. "We saw a deer today. It had spot. Mom said it was a baby. I named him Pepper." Drawings of trees and flowers filled the margins. Then the entry shifted. June 3rd. Dad says we have to climb. Something is wrong with Mom. She keeps saying things that don't make sense. She wanted to walk into the woods without her backpack. Dad won't let her. He says we need to go up where it's safe. June 4th. We're in the tree now. It's really high. I'm scared, but Dad says this is the only way. Mom is sleeping a lot. Dad gave me his phone to hold. He says if something happens to him, I should try to signal for help from up here. June 5th. Mom woke up, but she doesn't know where we are. She tried to climb down, but Dad stopped her. We ate the last of our food. Dad says someone will see us soon. I hope he's right. My elephant is helping me be brave. June 6th. Dad isn't moving anymore. I tried to wake him, but he won't wake up. Mom is... The entry ended there. The rest of the page was blank. Thomas read it 3 times. Each time the implications became more disturbing. Something had happened to Michelle. Something that made Robert feel they needed to climb a giant sequoia for safety. But safety from what? The phone provided more answers, but they only deepened the mystery. Robert's photo gallery showed the progression. Early photos from the trip were cheerful. The family at the trailhead. Sophia posing with a walking stick, Michelle laughing beside a stream. Then, on June 2nd, the photos changed. There was a series of images taken at their campsite. Michelle sitting by the fire, but her expression was vacant, staring at nothing. Another photo showed her standing at the edge of camp, her back to the camera, facing into the dark forest. The timestamp on that photo was 2:30 in the morning. The next photos were taken from high in a tree. The perspective was dizzying. You could see the forest floor far below. One image showed Sophia's face, tear-streaked, looking at the camera. Another showed rope tied around a branch. A third showed Michelle, secured with rope, unconscious or sleeping. The final photo was taken on June 6th. It showed Sophia, alone, the camera held at arm's length. Behind her, 2 bodies were visible, unmoving. The photo was blurry, like her hands had been shaking. The metadata confirmed what Thomas feared. These photos were taken from approximately 80 feet above ground level, in a tree that should have been impossible to climb. Thomas Blake stared at those photos for hours. He'd been a climber himself in his younger years. He knew what it took to ascend a giant sequoia: the equipment, the training, the physical strength. Robert Harper had been a software engineer from San Jose. His brother James confirmed Robert had no technical climbing experience. He'd hiked, he'd camped, but he'd never done vertical rescue or rope work. Yet somehow, he'd hauled his family 80 feet up a tree in the middle of a crisis. Thomas needed to understand how, not just for the investigation, but because it might reveal why the search had failed. If Robert had used a method that left visible traces the teams had missed, that was information they needed. He contacted Daniel Rodriguez, a professional arborist and technical rescue specialist based in Fresno. Daniel had climbed hundreds of giant sequoias for research and maintenance. If anyone could reverse engineer Robert's method, it was him. They met at the Sentinel tree on a cool morning in May 2024. Daniel brought his full climbing kit: rope, harnesses, pulleys, ascenders. He also brought something else, the exact type and length of rope that had been documented as missing from the Harper campsite in 2014. "Show me where the rope was tied," Daniel said. Thomas pointed to the branch 75 feet up where the weathered rope had been found. Daniel studied it through binoculars, noting the position, the angle, the distance from the trunk. "He didn't climb free," Daniel said after a long silence. "No way. That first branch is at least 60 feet up, and the trunk diameter here is about 15 feet. You can't hug your way up something that wide, and there's nothing to grab below that first branch. So how did he do it?" Daniel walked around the tree slowly, examining the bark. Giant sequoia bark is fibrous and deeply furrowed. It's fire-resistant and incredibly thick, sometimes over a foot deep, but it's not particularly good for climbing. No handholds, no obvious features to exploit. Then Daniel stopped. He crouched down, looking at something near the base of the tree. "Thomas, come look at this." There were marks in the bark, old marks, partially obscured by a decade of growth and weathering. But once you knew what you were looking for, they were obvious. Small gouges, arranged in a vertical pattern, each about 6 inches apart. "He made a ladder," Daniel said quietly. "He didn't climb the tree. He built steps into it." They found more marks as they circled the trunk, a spiral pattern, gradually ascending. The gouges were crude, but effective. Someone had used an axe or hatchet to chop small notches into the bark, each one deep enough to get a toehold. "This would have taken hours," Daniel said. "In the dark, probably, if his wife was having a medical emergency, and he would have had to do it while managing her, keeping her calm or restrained, watching his daughter." Thomas tried to imagine it. Robert, exhausted and terrified, hacking steps into a massive tree while his wife's mind deteriorated, each step bringing him a few inches closer to that first branch. 60 feet of steps, maybe 200 notches. Could it work? Thomas asked. Could someone actually climb this without formal training? "Let me find out." Daniel geared up and began to climb, following the pattern of old notches. He didn't use them for support. His modern equipment made the ascent safe and straightforward, but he tested each one, seeing if they would hold weight, checking their depth and stability. 40 minutes later, Daniel was at the branch where the rope had been tied. His voice came over the radio. "Thomas, he did it. These notches are solid. They go all the way up. Some are weathered, but most are still deep enough to use. An adult could climb this, especially if they were desperate. What about getting Michelle and Sophia up? That's where it gets impressive." Daniel was moving around on the branch now, examining the rope configuration. He tied off here, then created a pulley system, simple but effective. He probably hauled them up one at a time using a rope loop under their arms. Exhausting work, but possible. Once they were at this branch, he could have helped them climb the last 15 feet to the hollow. Daniel spent another hour in the canopy, documenting everything. He took photos, measured distances, tested theories. When he finally descended, his expression was grim. "That man saved their lives with this climb," Daniel said, "at least temporarily. If Michelle was having severe behavioral problems, if she was trying to wander off, getting her contained in that hollow was probably the only option. He couldn't carry her back to the trailhead. He couldn't restrain her on the ground safely. So he went vertical. Why didn't the search teams see the notches? Daniel shrugged. "Look at this bark. It's naturally furrowed and damaged. You'd have to know what you were looking for. And who would think to look? Nobody searches up." But someone should have, Thomas thought. If the scent dogs indicated vertical displacement, if there were signs the family hadn't traveled far, Someone should have considered the possibility. While Daniel worked on the physical evidence, another team was investigating Michelle Harper's medical history. With James Harper's permission, they obtained her medical record. What they found explained everything. Michelle had been diagnosed with a cerebral aneurysm 3 years before the hiking trip, a small bulge in a blood vessel in her brain. Her doctors had monitored it. The aneurysm was stable, not large enough to require surgery. She'd been told to avoid extreme physical stress and to report any severe headaches immediately, but she'd felt fine. The family had planned the Sequoia trip for months. Sophia was excited. Michelle didn't want to cancel over a medical issue that her doctor said was low risk, so they'd gone ahead with the trip. The exertion of backpacking, the elevation, the physical stress, it must have been enough. On the night of June 2nd, or the early morning of June 3rd, the aneurysm had ruptured. The bleeding in her brain would have caused immediate and severe symptoms: confusion, disorientation, personality changes, possibly hallucinations. Robert would have woken to find his wife acting completely unlike herself, not knowing where she was, maybe not recognizing him. In the dark, miles from help, with no way to call for medical assistance, he'd been facing an impossible situation. The medical examiner confirmed that Michelle's remains showed evidence consistent with a ruptured aneurysm. The location of the bleeding would have caused the behavioral symptoms Robert documented in the photos. She would have seemed fine one moment, then completely altered the next, and there would have been nothing Robert could do except try to keep her safe until help arrived. James Harper provided more context. He'd spoken to Robert on June 1st, the day before Michelle's medical emergency. Robert told me Michelle had complained of a headache that afternoon, James said, but she'd said it was just altitude and dehydration. She took some ibuprofen and felt better. Robert asked if they should turn back, but Michelle insisted she was fine. That headache had likely been the warning sign, a sentinel bleed, doctors call it, a small leak that precedes a major rupture. If they'd turned back then, if they'd hiked out immediately, Michelle would have made it to a hospital. She might have survived, but they'd stayed, and the next night, the aneurysm had fully ruptured. Investigators reconstructed the timeline based on all available evidence. Here's what they believed happened. June 2nd, around midnight, Michelle woke with severe confusion. Robert found her trying to leave the tent without her shoes, talking about needing to go home, but unable to articulate where home was. June 3rd, early morning, Robert realized Michelle's condition was deteriorating. She became agitated when he tried to keep her in the tent. He made the decision to climb. If she was in the tree hollow, she couldn't wander into the forest and get lost. The confined space would keep her safe. June 3rd, morning to afternoon. Robert spent hours chopping notches into the sentinel tree. Sophia helped by keeping Michelle distracted, reading to her, trying to keep her calm. When the steps were complete, Robert climbed up first, secured the rope, then hauled Michelle up using the pulley system. Finally, Sophia climbed with Robert guiding her. June 3rd, late afternoon. The family was in the hollow. Robert had successfully gotten them to a safe, contained space. He activated his emergency beacon and checked his phone repeatedly, hoping for a signal. Nothing. They were too deep in the forest, the canopy too thick. June 4th, Michelle's condition worsened. She was semi-conscious, non-responsive. Robert kept her hydrated and comfortable. He wrote notes on his phone, messages to his brother, to Sophia, instructions for anyone who might find them. He took photos to document their location, hoping the metadata would help rescuers. June 5th, the first helicopter passed overhead. Robert tried to signal, waving his bright orange rain jacket, but the canopy obscured them. The helicopter moved on. Robert wrote in his note, "They flew right over us. They didn't see. We'll try again tomorrow." June 6th, Michelle died. Robert recorded it in his note. Michelle passed at approximately 10 a.m. Sophia is being so brave. I don't know how much longer we can last. If anyone finds this, please tell James we tried. Tell him we did everything we could. June 7th, Robert's last note. Very weak now. No water left. Sophia is sleeping. Told her help is coming. She believes me. I don't have the heart to tell her the truth. If this is the end, At least we're together. At least she's not alone. June 8th, Robert died. Sophia was alone. Her journal entry from that day was brief. Dad isn't moving anymore. I tried to wake him, but he won't wake up. June 9th or 10th, Sophia died. The medical examiner couldn't determine the exact day, but based on the journal entries and the condition of the remains, she survived approximately 36 to 48 hours after Robert's death. A 10-year-old girl, alone in a tree with her dead parent, holding a stuffed elephant, waiting for rescue. When investigators presented this timeline to James Harper, he listened in silence. Then he asked to see Robert's notes from the phone. Every word, every photo. The notes were heartbreaking. Robert had written extensively, knowing he might not survive. He'd written about his love for Michelle and Sophia. He'd written about his regret, wishing he'd turned back when Michelle had that headache. He'd written about the climb, explaining his reasoning, hoping someone would understand why he'd made that choice. One note stood out to James. I know people will wonder why I didn't try to hike out for help, why I didn't leave Michelle and Sophia here and go get rescue myself. The truth is, I couldn't. Michelle wasn't stable enough to leave alone. Even tied up, she might have hurt herself trying to escape the ropes, and I couldn't take Sophia with me and leave Michelle alone to die in that hollow. So I decided we'd stay together. We'd wait for the search teams that I knew were coming. I'd seen helicopters. I'd heard sounds that might have been people in the distance. I thought they'd find us within a day or two. I was wrong, but I'd make the same choice again. We're together. That matters more than anything. James read that passage during a press conference 6 months after the remains were found. His voice broke halfway through, but he finished. My brother was a hero, James said. He faced an impossible situation, and he chose love. He chose to keep his family together. The system failed him. The search protocols failed him, but he didn't fail them. The press conference sparked national debate. Should search protocols include canopy searches? Should thermal imaging be recalibrated? Should more resources be devoted to wilderness rescue? Some argued that Robert had made a fatal error, that he should have tried to hike out, that climbing the tree had trapped them. But Daniel Rodriguez, the arborist who'd studied Robert's work, disagreed. People don't understand what he was facing, Daniel told reporters. A woman with a brain hemorrhage will wander. She'll walk away from safety and into danger. On the ground, in that forest, Michelle would have been impossible to manage. She might have walked off a cliff, fallen into a ravine, gotten hypothermia from stripping off her clothes, which brain injury patients sometimes do. Robert's climb saved them from those immediate dangers. It gave them a chance. The failure wasn't his. It was ours. We didn't look up. Thomas Blake agreed. He'd reviewed the search records extensively. The scent dogs had indicated vertical displacement on the first day. Rita Chen had literally said the family might have gone up, but no one had taken it seriously. No one had looked at the giant sequoias and thought maybe they climbed. The Sentinel tree search in June 2014 had been thorough on the ground. Every square foot within a mile had been examined, but not a single searcher had looked up. Not one had considered that a family might be 80 feet overhead, trapped in a hollow, dying slowly, while the teams walked beneath them. Thomas requested the helicopter footage from every pass over the Sentinel tree area. There were 14 flights between June 7th and June 20th. On 7 of those flights, the helicopters had passed directly over or near the Sentinel tree. The thermal imaging data was stored in Park Service archive. Thomas reviewed every file, and there it was. Multiple anomalous readings in the canopy of the Sentinel tree. Small heat signatures, partially obscured by branches. Each one had been flagged in the data, but each one had been classified as probable wildlife or thermal artifact. On June 5th, the day Robert wrote about waving his jacket, a helicopter had passed within 200 feet of the tree. The thermal camera had picked up a clear signature. 3 distinct heat sources clustered together. The crew had noted it. Possible large animal den, canopy level, Sentinel tree area. Does not match search parameters. 3 heat sources. Robert, Michelle, and Sophia. Alive. Visible on thermal imaging. And dismissed as not relevant to the search. Thomas showed the footage to the helicopter crew. They were both retired now, but they agreed to review their work. Both men went pale when they saw the thermal signature and realized what it had been. "We were looking for ground signatures," one of them said. "The search parameters were clear. We were supposed to flag anything on or near the forest floor. Canopy readings were considered noise. We had dozens of them every flight. Birds, squirrels, other wildlife. We weren't trained to consider them as potential finds." It wasn't their fault, not really. They'd followed their training. They'd done what the protocols required. But the protocols had been wrong. The system had been designed to find people on the ground, not people who'd gone vertical out of desperation. The National Park Service commissioned a full review. The findings were released in October 2024. The report was damning. It identified systemic failures at multiple levels, inadequate search protocols, insufficient training for unusual scenarios, over-reliance on technology without understanding its limitations, failure to adapt when evidence suggested non-standard situations. 23 recommendations were made. All were adopted immediately. Canopy searches were added to standard protocol. Thermal imaging parameters were adjusted. Search teams would now include at least one member with technical climbing experience. And most importantly, searchers would be trained to question their assumptions, to think vertically, not just horizontally. The Harper family's deaths prompted changes that would save lives. In the 2 years since the new protocols were implemented, 6 searches in national parks across the country had included vertical components. 3 of those searches had found people in unexpected, elevated locations. All 3 were alive when found. But for James Harper, the policy changes were cold comfort. His brother's family was still gone. Sophia had still died alone, waiting for a rescue that came 10 years too late. James established the Harper Wilderness Foundation. Its mission was simple: ensure no family would ever again be missed because search teams only looked in predictable places. The foundation funded training, equipment, and research into non-traditional search methods. Every year on June 3rd, James returned to the Sentinel Tree. He'd climb using modern equipment, following the route Robert had carved into the bark. He'd sit in the hollow where his brother's family had died, and he'd stay there for an hour in silence, imagining what those final days had been like. He'd think about Sophia, brave and scared, holding her elephant. He'd think about Robert, dying by inches, knowing he'd failed to save his family, but still grateful they were together. He'd think about Michelle, her brilliant mind destroyed by a ruptured blood vessel, unaware of the tragedy unfolding around her. And every year, James would leave something in the hollow: a note, a photo, a small toy for Sophia. Tokens of love and grief that would weather and fade, just like the memories of those who didn't know the Harper family's story. But the story wouldn't fade. Not anymore. The backpack in the tree had made sure of that. Sophia's journal had made sure of that. The photos from 80 feet up had made sure of that. The Harper family had been invisible for 10 years. Now they would never be forgotten. Forensic analysis of the backpack revealed something else. Plant material embedded in the fabric. Lichen species that only grow above 70 feet in sequoia canopies. Insect remains from species that live exclusively in the upper forest layers. This backpack had definitely been in that tree for years. But how did it get there? And more importantly, where were the bodies? The recovery team that retrieved the backpack had been focused on the single branch where it was found. Now, Thomas requested a complete canopy survey of the Sentinel Tree. Every branch, every hollow, every possible space large enough to hold human remains. The search took 3 days. Arborists moved through the canopy with ropes and harnesses, documenting everything. On day 2, they found the first evidence. Rope. Professional climbing rope, weathered and partially deteriorated. It was tied around a branch 75 feet up. The knots were complex, the kind used in technical climbing. Someone who knew what they were doing had secured that rope. Following the rope led them to a natural hollow in the trunk, about 80 feet up. Sequoias sometimes develop these cavities as they age. This one was roughly 6 feet deep and 4 feet wide, large enough for people to shelter inside. And inside, they found remains. 3 sets, 2 adults, 1 child. They were positioned in a way that suggested they'd been trying to stay warm, huddled together. Fabric fragments indicated they'd used their remaining clothes as insulation. Rope was still tied around what remained of the adults' torsos, likely to prevent anyone from falling during sleep. The medical examiner's report would take weeks, but preliminary findings were clear. All 3 had died from exposure and dehydration, but there was something else. Michelle Harper's remains showed evidence of a brain hemorrhage. A stroke or aneurysm, the examiner suggested. Something catastrophic that would have caused severe behavioral changes and confusion. Suddenly, Robert's decision made terrible sense. On the night of June 2nd or early morning of June 3rd, Michelle had suffered a medical emergency. In the wilderness, miles from help, with no way to communicate, Robert had watched his wife deteriorate. She was confused, trying to wander off, potentially putting herself and Sophia in danger. So Robert made a choice. He decided to go up, to climb to a place where Michelle couldn't wander away and get lost, to a place where they might be more visible to search helicopters, to a place where he could keep his family together while they waited for rescue. The rope found in the tree matched rope missing from their campsite. Robert had used it to rig a climbing system. The knots suggested he'd created a pulley mechanism, something that would allow him to haul Michelle and Sophia up even though they weren't experienced climbers. It must have taken hours. Exhausting, terrifying hours, pulling his family 80 feet into a tree. But he'd done it. The photos showed they'd made it. They'd survived the climb. But rescue never came. The search teams had been looking on the ground. The helicopters had been using thermal imaging, but the thick canopy and the hollow in the trunk would have shielded their heat signatures. And the search dogs had been right. The scent had gone up, but no one had believed that was possible. So the Harper family had waited in that tree hollow. They'd rationed their water. They'd used their phones sparingly, hoping to preserve battery for a chance signal. They'd tried to stay warm as June nights dropped into the 40s. Michelle had died first, probably within the first few days. Her medical condition was too severe. Robert had stayed alive longer, long enough to write notes on his phone, messages to his brother that he must have hoped would someday be found. We're in the big tree. The Sentinel. Please find Sophia. I'm sorry. Sophia had outlived them both. A 10-year-old girl, alone in a tree, with her parents' bodies beside her. Her journal entries stopped on June 6th. The medical examiner estimated she survived until June 8th or 9th, 9 days after they climbed, 2 days after the official search ended. The question that haunted everyone was simple. Why didn't she try to climb down? The answer came from analyzing the rope system Robert had built. He'd designed it for going up, not down. The pulleys were configured for ascending. Once they were in the tree, descending safely would have required different rigging, different knowledge. Robert probably intended to modify the system once they were rescued, or once Michelle recovered enough to help. But he'd run out of time. And Sophia, at 10 years old, looking at an 80-foot drop with rope she didn't know how to use, had been trapped. She'd done everything she could. She'd kept her journal. She'd held her father's phone, probably hoping it would somehow connect, somehow send a signal. She'd stayed with her parents in that hollow because Robert had taught her to stay put when lost. Wait for rescue. Don't wander. She'd followed her father's instructions perfectly, and it had killed her. James Harper was shown the evidence in a private briefing. He sat in silence as investigators explained what they'd found, what they believed had happened. When they finished, he asked only one question. Were they visible from the air? Thomas Blake pulled up the helicopter footage from 2014. Thermal images from June 10th through June 15th, days when the family was still alive. He ran through the footage slowly. There. On June 12th, a thermal signature in the canopy of the sentinel tree. It was faint, partially obscured by branches. The helicopter had flown over it twice, but the crew had been looking for ground-level signatures. They'd noted the canopy reading in their report as possible animal den, and moved on. They'd been right there. The helicopter had been directly overhead. If the crew had investigated that reading, if they'd thought to look up instead of down, the Harpers would have been found. They would have survived. James Harper watched the footage 3 times. Then he stood up and left the room without a word. The National Park Service launched an internal review. How had this happened? How had an entire family climbed into a tree and remained undiscovered for 10 years? The findings were damning. The search protocols focused almost entirely on ground-level searching. Canopy searches weren't part of standard procedure. Thermal imaging was calibrated to filter out readings above a certain height, specifically to reduce false positives from birds and other wildlife. In essence, the system was designed to miss exactly what happened to the Harpers. Policy changes came swiftly. New protocols for canopy searches, revised thermal imaging parameters, training for search teams on vertical displacement scenarios. Arborists were added to search and rescue teams for major operations, but none of it helped the Harpers. The sentinel tree became a memorial site. People leave flowers at its base. Some leave climbing rope, coiled neatly, a tribute to Robert's desperate attempt to save his family. A plaque was installed, in memory of the Harper family. Sometimes the bravest choices still lead to tragedy. Sophia's journal is preserved in the park's archive. It's not on public display. Thomas Blake argued that some things should remain private, but he reads it sometimes, when cases go cold, when families wait for answers. He thinks about Sophia's last entry. Dad isn't moving anymore. I tried to wake him, but he won't wake up. He thinks about a little girl, alone in a tree, holding a stuffed elephant, believing rescue was coming because her father had promised it would. He thinks about the helicopter that flew overhead, the thermal signature dismissed as wildlife, the crew moving on to search another grid square. The wilderness is full of impossible choices. Robert Harper had faced one when Michelle's brain began to fail. Climb or stay? Risk the ascent or risk her wandering into the forest? He'd chosen to climb, to go where she couldn't fall, where they'd be together, where rescue might find them. It was a reasonable choice given what he knew. It was a brave choice. It was a father protecting his family the only way he could think of. And it killed them all anyway. Kyle Morrison, the arborist who found the backpack, requested a transfer after the remains were recovered. He couldn't work in that grove anymore, couldn't climb those trees without thinking about what he'd found, about a family dying slowly in a hollow while the world searched for them below. The last photo on Robert Harper's phone is the one investigators return to most often. It's Sophia, probably taken by Robert a day or two before he died. She's looking at the camera with an expression that breaks your heart. Not panic, not despair, just patience, waiting, trusting that her father knew what he was doing, that rescue was coming, that everything would be okay. She believed him until the very end. The forest doesn't care about belief. It doesn't care about bravery or good intentions or doing everything right. The forest just is, patient and indifferent and always, always unforgiving of even the smallest miscalculation. Robert Harper calculated that going up would save his family. He was wrong, but there's no way he could have known that. No way he could have predicted that search teams would look everywhere except where he'd taken them. Sometimes survival comes down to pure chance, the random decision that turns out right, the lucky guess that leads to rescue. The Harper family's chance was a helicopter crew noticing an anomalous thermal reading and deciding to investigate instead of flying past. They flew past, and 80 feet above the ground, 3 people waited in a tree for help that never came, while hundreds of searchers walked beneath them, looking for signs in all the wrong places.